Dun, 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 dun. Time for part two of the conservative impulse in a radical age. In part one, we talked about conservatism in the wilderness and the role of the new republic. We talked about the Goldwater effect and the Goldwater insurgency, and then Young Americans for Freedom. In this part of the conservative impulse in a radical age lecture, we're going to talk about Nixon and conservatism in American politics, and the court case Roe v. Wade and American politics. So let's look at Nixon. In the mid to late 1960s, you have a growing conservative movement developing at the same time and in response to the growing radicalism within American society. So, as there are growing radical movements or growing radicalization in American society, there's also conservative, for lack of a better term, backlash. By the mid 1960s, so 65, 66 ish, you find politicians start talking about the breakdown in society as the student protests and the urban riots start growing in intensity. 1966, Ronald Reagan is elected governor in California. He ran on a conservative/traditionalist platform, arguing that the Democratic governor, Pat Brown, was proving unable to control the use of the state. He emphasized law and order over the chaos that Brown represented. That same year, in 1966, Nixon writes what would be considered an op-ed today. He writes an article entitled, "If Mob Rule Takes Hold in the United States." And in this piece, he emphasized his law and order credentials, basically saying, I've been for law and order my entire career. He blames the urban and youth violence on the universities, particularly professors. So even back in the 1960s, we're starting to get this sense amongst conservatives that the universities are this bastion of liberalism, and if you send your child there, they will be brainwashed into thinking in a way that is against the family. And he blames urban and youth violence on other national figures such as Bobby Kennedy, suggesting that violence is okay. And all Bobby Kennedy says is, and I'm paraphrasing, is he understood the frustration in these communities and understood why some could turn towards violence. Now, in 1968, we have Nixon on the one hand for the Republicans versus Hubert Humphreys for the Democrats. 1968, this is after Tet. The U.S. had been getting more and more deeply involved in Vietnam for 4 years. And during the presidential campaign, Nixon only has one singular TV ad that focused on Vietnam, with the majority of his ads focused on a, quote, domestic crisis. So we're looking at, out of 10 ads that were aired, for lack of a better term, nationwide, only one of them dealt with Vietnam. The others involved crime. It involved law and order. It involved the first civil right, the right to life. And to go along with the growing emphasis on law and order, chunk, Nixon starts championing this idea of a new federalism, and started appointing officials and, more importantly, judges who shared similar beliefs. New federalism is this idea that the federal government has too much power vis-a-vis the states, and that some of the autonomy and some of the power should be restored to the individual states. So taking some power away from the federal government and bringing it back to the state level. Most conservatives believe that this could be done with a greater invoking of the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 10th Amendment says, quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So, New Federalists or people who believe in New Federalism will argue that if it's not in the Constitution, if it is not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution or directly given to the US government by the states, then that power is the states and the states have the right to say no. Many conservatives believe that the states could do as good a job, if not better, running certain aspects of the government than the federal government. And this is kind of ironic. This example I'm about to use is kind of ironic considering the world we're living in right now. But healthcare is often seen as a prime example of this. Many conservatives believe that the states can run healthcare for their citizens better than a federal government can for the entirety of the nation. And so Nixon and others in his administration believed the best way of advancing this position would be through promoting like minded individuals in the government and, most importantly, in the courts. My apologies for that pause there. So, Nixon and others believed the best way to advance this position would be through promoting like minded individuals in the government and in the courts. And it's kind of funny because here you're talking about taking power away from the federal government, and Nixon is trying to work within the system to take power away from the federal government. One of the best examples of this is William Rehnquist, Rehnquist. Rehnquist gets hired on in the Justice Department, acting as chief lawyer for the Attorney General, that is, dealing with any lawsuits directed towards the Attorney General himself, and providing legal counsel to the Attorney General and the President. Nixon has 2 slots to fill in the Supreme Court in 1971 when someone suggests Rehnquist for one of the positions. Someone suggests that Rehnquist is pretty far to the right, and Haldeman, one of Nixon's top advisors, exclaims, quote, "Oh Christ, he is way to the right of Buchanan." This references Patrick Buchanan, the man who claimed that Hurricane Katrina was, quote, God's punishment on New Orleans. Nixon does appoint Rehnquist to the Supreme Court. Rehnquist is Nixon's third choice. He attempts to get 2 Southerners appointed to the bench, but ends up running into more opposition than expected, including at one point one of the potential nominees. It was found out he tried pot before, so that took him out of the running. But from his appointment in 1971 to when he became Chief Justice in 1986, Rehnquist pushed and often made dissents, dissent, dissents in court as he continued to push for new federalism, often claiming that if a government has a power, he would argue that that power was unduly given to the federal government and should be returned to the states. After 1986, when he was appointed Chief Justice, to his death in 2007, I believe, Rehnquist focused more on the status of the Supreme Court itself, often trying to maneuver into a position where the prestige of the court would not be adversely affected. The Nixon administration is going to be where we're going to have the framework for the Reagan Revolution in 1980. And the Nixon administration will provide extensive government experience for future bigwigs in the Republican Party. Here are just 2 examples. Richard Cheney, Dick Cheney, would serve in various positions in the White House before serving as White House Chief of Staff for President Gerald Ford. Donald Rumsfeld will serve as a counselor for President Nixon before serving as President Ford's Chief of Staff prior to Cheney, and then Ford's Defense Secretary. So people who will come up and into positions of power in even the George W. Bush years, are getting extensive government experience in the 1970s with Nixon and Ford. Now, we've talked a bit about this in the discussion, so I want to talk about this. Many of the discussions I heard talked about conservatism in an evangelical, a Protestant biblical position. And we need to talk about how we get the evangelicals into the conservative movement. And the way that conservatives appeal to evangelicals was through their social conservatism. And what will be the galvanizing moment for evangelicals is the Supreme Court case Roe versus Wade in 1973. Roe v. Wade is going to be one of the defining Supreme Court cases of the 20th century. It is a victory for women's reproductive rights, as well as a catalyst for one of the fundamental divisions in American politics. At its core, the core of the decision, the Supreme Court held that the right to privacy extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion, but that this right must be balanced with the legitimate right of states in regulating abortion. That is, the state has a legitimate right to protect prenatal life and the health of the mother. Roe v. Wade will bring the trimester system used by medical professionals in the 60s and 70s, and even today, to the court of law. The state regulation of abortion in Roe v. Wade was tied to the trimester of pregnancy. Roe v. Wade would argue that the state has less of an interest in the initial stages of pregnancy, but that this interest, with respect to regulating abortion, grows later in the pregnancy. Politically, Roe v. Wade will galvanize many Americans, and you have organizations created specifically to support pro-choice or oppose pro-life, the ruling in Roe v. Wade. And I've always had to chuckle a little bit. And I know you shouldn't chuckle about a case like this, but the way that they decided to name each group to either support Roe or oppose Roe. Those who support refer to themselves as pro-choice, implying that the other side is anti-choice. And those who oppose the ruling of Roe v. Wade call themselves pro-life, which by implication means anybody opposing them is anti-life. So it's a nice little way to sort of do an us versus them on either side of the position. Now, with respect to conservatism, Roe v. Wade galvanized the evangelical, that is Protestant, population in the United States, specifically in the South. This case will provoke many of these evangelicals into the realm of politics. Many will view the case as one of, quote, judicial activism, and began to organize opposition to liberals and so-called liberal judges who, in the mind of evangelicals, support moving the government into all aspects of the lives of citizens. And this would provide intense grassroots support for any politician that opposed Roe. So Roe v. Wade became a litmus test for conservative politicians. And you might be going, well, why would evangelicals, why would Protestants be such an important group? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, they vote. But number two, if you've ever seen a episode of The Simpsons when they're dealing specifically with the church, Many evangelicals have a close relationship with their church, and many of these churches have phone trees, like a phone tree. And what that means is one person calls two others. Each of those two call two more. Each of those call two more, and so on and so forth as it spreads out, allowing them to more quickly get their message across within their community, to galvanize support for a particular politician or galvanize opposition against a particular politician. In a way, Roe v. Wade will get white evangelicals politically motivated in the same way that civil rights in the late 50s, early 60s got African American evangelicals motivated into politics. In some cases, you would have entire church or congregations act as a local political army to encourage support for selected politicians. This was as much a moral issue as it was a political issue for many evangelicals, because many evangelicals believe in the idea of life starting at conception and believed that the legalization of abortion in the 1970s was a moral sin perpet- per- perpetrated, there we go, by the government. So many found themselves on the side of conservatives to begin with. And when you have conservatives starting to go, oh, look at these liberal judges bringing government into the bedroom, that shifted many evangelicals to start acting politically for the conservative movement. So I would suggest that by 1973, rather than three pillars, you would have four pillars within the conservative movement. You would have traditionalism, you would have libertarianism, you would have anti-communism, and you would have evangelicalism, which means obviously after the fall of the Soviet Union, and today those four uh, those four pillars would drop down to three. So the modern conservative movement, typically an umbrella movement of libertarians, traditionalists, and evangelicals. By 1968, we have Richard Nixon tapping into the growing discontent of Middle America, particularly over domestic issues of law and order, the perceived breakdown of American society, more so than foreign policy, that is, Vietnam. By 1972, we have the growth and development of a burgeoning conservative movement that starts to challenge the increasingly fractured liberal consensus in American politics. The liberal consensus government can be a force of good for the greatest amount of Americans will fracture over the American response to Vietnam and fracture over the seeming instability brought upon by the various movement cultures, including the youth culture. By 1976, the conservative movement in the Republican Party grew enough to directly challenge the sitting president for the nomination of the Republican Party. Gerald Ford is barely able to stave off a challenge from Ronald Reagan. And many conservatives will, and many within the Republican Party will argue that Ford was wounded enough that he was not able to hold off Jimmy Carter. And if they had only elected Reagan in 76, well, Reagan would have easily won. That's the conservative argument. It's important to note that the conservative movement is not limited to the Republican Party. The Democratic Party also drifts, I should say, closer to the center during the same period. So you have the development of what I've talked about in the last lecture, or last part of the lecture. The development of what is referred to as blue dog Democrats. These are Democrats who are fiscally conservative but can have socially liberal policies. All right, so that is it for the conservative movement. We are going to be shifting our view next to the end of the lecture. We're going to talk about this quote, "A generation lasts 2 or 3 years," and then we're going to talk about extremism in the 1960s. All right, I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.